Since a Cyberpunk Ghost Story, the sort of retro-style adventure game by Suzaku and Top Hat Studios, is a game I've had my eye on for what seems like years now. By the time I started paying attention to it, however, its Kickstarter was already more than fully funded, so I can't say I was a paying supporter of the game, just somebody who was optimistically watching it and expecting it to release on PlayStation Vita. But as time ticked by, my time spent on Vita started to be replaced by my time spent on the not quite as sexy Nintendo Switch, which thankfully the game was also announced to be releasing on, and what we're looking at it on today. This is a game I expected a pretty quiet release for. However, just before the release marketing for the game was set to begin, a controversy beset it. Top Hat Studios published a screenshot of numerous messages they've received from angry people demeaning the company for willing to publish the title. These messages were laden with threats and demands the game be cancelled, pulled from online stores, or censored. According to Top Hat, they published these images to give some transparency for what it's like for a company like theirs to take risks on games like this, to highlight where the real problems lie with social discourse, and to make the statement absolutely official that they will not bend the knee to threats of this nature and alter the content of their game. A commendable act that I fully agree with their position on. However, in all this, I believe another issue about social discourse has arisen. In support of Top Hat and their decisions, it feels as if response to this game online may now be a little more positive than it really earns. As if the developer espousing a lot of agreeable political views makes the game worthy of high praise and a pedestal to be set upon. In many circles, the game, the company's politics, and the controversy are all treated as one and the same, but they're not, and it's not hard to separate them. So, to put it out there and say it bluntly, Top Hat, Suzaku, I completely support your decisions and I'm proud of you. I think you've done the right thing and set a good example, but your game could use a lot of work. In all honesty, since a Cyberpunk Ghost Story isn't that good. In fact, I'd go so far as to say it's kind of bad. And the optimization job on Switch only makes it worse. And yes, I crawled out of the dumpster this morning to tell all you guys that. It does have nice art though, so let's get into it. So let's begin this review by beginning at the start. See, I knew a thesaurus would come in handy. Things start off promising enough. The neon cyberpunkopolis looks pretty slick, and the streets are littered with unique looking NPCs. Some of these NPCs are based on real online personalities that I recognize pretty quickly, like Bunny Ayu and Swimsuit Succubus here, or these three in the back part of the game. While wandering these streets, we get a brief look at the kind of life these people live. Crime runs rampant, and the commodification of sexuality and the human form has made body modification the new norm. Here we get a brief tutorial of sorts and learn how the game's mechanics largely work, walking from place to place, collecting items, and interacting with people to solve light puzzles and forge a path ahead. Interacting with things here, we also see some of the politics the developers employ and just shoved into the game. Some feels rather referential or prophetic of the game's launch itself, but feel really out of place for casual observation. Despite this, this is the most promising area of the game, and we are here for less than an hour. Our main character, May, arrives at a bar where she intends to meet a friend for a date. However, before her date arrives, she takes to a bout of disorientation caused by her ocular implants. She takes to the bar's washroom to perform repair work, but upon leaving, she finds herself mysteriously transported to an old derelict building that has been abandoned since the 1980s. And this is where we spend the rest of the game. The cyberpunk world is nearly entirely left behind to tell a ghost story in an old apartment complex that has been abandoned since the 80s and left as it was. A more accurate title for this game would have been Sense, a ghost story that's bookended with some cyberpunk stuff. But I guess that doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well. At this point, May is trapped. She's tormented by ghosts and desperate for an escape. And so begins our adventure. Gameplay follows a lot of point and click sensibilities or even Silent Hill puzzle solving stuff. It's almost entirely inventory and riddle based and chalked top to bottom with obnoxious amount of backtracking, which I don't mind too much when it makes sense. But here, it doesn't always, and this can be an ongoing source of frustration and annoyance. There are so many useful items that the game tells you can't pick up yet, so that it can pad its runtime by forcing you to backtrack for it later. If there was an inventory limit, maybe I could get behind this, but there isn't, and the extent to which they do this is just absurd. To make matters worse, puzzle logic is hit or miss. Players sometimes are given perfectly reasonable solutions to puzzles that the game just doesn't allow. At one one point, the game gave me a box that was heavily taped up. I found a fine pair of scissors, which I don't know about you guys, but that's how I open boxes at home, and apparently it wasn't a suitable enough tool for the job. Those scissors, however, led me to a kunai a short while later. Kunai are pretty sharp and probably suitable for the task as well, but because it's not the exact tool the game wants you to use, this was also not acceptable. Eventually, you do find a rusty box cutter, which of course, as the name quite literally implies, is the appropriate tool for the job. But if they were going to be so particular about locking the contents of this box away from the player, they should have found a way to do it that the player didn't already have other perfectly logical solutions for. And things only get worse when this game's version of combat is introduced. If we can even call it combat, and I'm not so sure we can. Eventually you get a sword which can be used to banish spirits. Simply hitting X at the enemies will extinguish their spirits and allow you to progress, but it feels just awful. Probably one of the biggest sins this game commits is reminding me of the combat in the top-down section of Massive Cleavage vs. the Zombies. And I get it, most of you likely don't have that frame of reference, but based on the name alone, I'm sure you know it's not a good thing. The animation for this is pathetic, and the hitboxes feel almost non-existent. To make matters even worse, the optimization on Switch anytime an enemy is on screen, or when a room has a special event waiting to be triggered, is extremely poor. The frame rate will dip to around 10 or so, and button inputs become delayed or entirely unresponsive. There's actually two bosses in this game, though you beat them both the same way. I'd say they were straight clones of each other, but I never seen the final boss even attack, so I'm not 100% sure on that. I guess they try to raise the stakes a bit with the stamina meter, ideally making it so you have to choose hiding instead of running, as one hit from a ghost is all it takes to kill you if you don't have any jade bangles equipped. But I never really had this cause any issues. I probably ran out of stamina once, but these ghosts aren't exactly Usain Bolt. Mechanically, there's not much else we can go over. The game does have a limited save file system similar to Resident Evil's ink ribbons, only here we use Betamax tapes. But you can ignore this entirely if you want and just favor the quick saves. I'd personally recommend using quick saves too, just so you don't set yourself back too much upon dying. Not because dying is frequent or anything, but because the art stills for deaths are some of the most interesting things the game has to offer, and you might want to trigger deaths here and there just to see them. There's also invisible interact points which you can identify by the blinking light on your PDA. When these come up, you simply press a button to take a picture and discover a hidden ghost. But that is about it. New Game Plus has a couple extra collectibles, but go ahead and ask me if I'm gonna bother with that. Credit where it's due though, while the main story is kind of a massive pile of missed potential, the subplots you read about in the collected journals offer substantially more. If you're looking for even remotely interesting stories, this is where you're gonna find them. But by the end of it all, I found the overarching story incredibly uninteresting and unrewarding. The gameplay and puzzles were poorly thought out, the combat was laughable, and the optimization was absolutely inexcusable. Sadly, character development wasn't considered too much either. For somebody like me and my tastes, this really didn't hit many of the right notes, but it absolutely could have. Thankfully, from my experience, the game wasn't very long at around 6 hours, though it can likely be completed in 4 if you know what you're doing, and 2 if you didn't have to backtrack to collect arbitrarily restricted items. Segue to sound. One area I never focus on too much in my reviews is the sound, as these days, serviceable to good is the default, so there's not typically much to note, but that's not really the case with Sense. If I start with the good parts of the sound here, we have a very short list. About half of the music is actually decent and suits the atmosphere. There isn't much music in the game, but it's not entirely annoying, and that's the end of the good stuff. Sound effects in general aren't very good, and ambience tracks are often absent. Sadly, one of the best aspects of the game is massively undercut by the lacking sound design as well. The art and character designs in Sense are really alluring, and the place they're shown off the best is in the still image comic book style cutscenes. Cutscene direction is a little wonky and hard to decipher sometimes, and I want to say that that's not a huge deal, but small decisions in the sound effects department could have gone a long ways to make these easier to interpret or liven them up a bit. Even something as simple as adding swishes and swooshes on the panels as they slide in, but they couldn't even be bothered to do that. On the environments, I'm not gonna harp too much on the environments because I get it. They had a budget, but there are some oddities. Like, if you look at these things here hanging on the wall and then look over here on the same wall, what is that? It looks to me like it's the back of the stairs. But if that's the back of the stairs, then there's no wall here holding these things up, right? For the record, these aren't ghost decorations, and that's not a ghost wall. These probably aren't ghost stairs either. This isn't Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Stairs story. It's just a graphical issue that wasn't caught or ironed out. Although I might unironically like a game with that premise, the ghost stairs premise. Anyway, those sort of things aren't insanely common, but they are here. But you know what? It's not exactly my thing to just beat on a game, and I'd rather not continue beyond what's really necessary. So I'm gonna leave this here. Sense, a Cyberpunk Ghost Story is a game I feel had a lot of promise, and something I'd like to see the developers continue working on. With everything they learned with this one, if they could secure the budget and enough development time, I think they could make something out of all of this. Make a proper series. But they really need to adjust their focus and pay more attention to parts of the game build that felt like afterthoughts. Regardless of my thoughts though, the game does have fans. And if you think it looks interesting, maybe give it a check someday, on the cheap, on a different platform. But don't say I told you to, say the fans did, cause I'm not really seeing much great here. So there it is, folks. Sometimes a game with a great premise that, you know, seems like a game that's gonna be for you, or in this case for me, just isn't firing on enough cylinders to actually take off. And that's kind of what happened here. That's not to say this is the end of the story, though. The foundation is still good, the core concept is still good, and I don't want to see it abandoned. It just needs to be built upon a bit better. Substantially better. And I get it, Suzaku, making a game is hard. It's a lot harder than anything I'm doing here on this channel. And I don't really want to just come in here and take swings at you guys. I know you don't have it easy. But sadly, this is just how I feel, so here's hoping for a better future. If this becomes a series, I'm still going to be interested in it, and I'm still going to be keeping tabs on how it's doing, even if this one didn't do it for me. But that's going to be all for this game today. If you guys enjoyed this video or found it helpful or useful at all, you know the deal. Like, comment, subscribe, and share the video if you can. Links to all of my socials and my Patreon support page are in the description below, and as always, folks, thanks for watching. Really did crawl out of the dumpster today, Jesus Christ.